So we are going to be looking at this pretty unusual move by the Department of Justice to try and get a federal judge removed from a case.
Yeah, and you don't see that very often. It's a pretty high bar they have to clear.
And the case involves the law firm Perkins Coie, quite famous, especially for those of us following these sorts of legal and political development.
Yeah, exactly. They were pretty prominently involved in the 2016 election.
Right. So we're going to try and figure out what exactly is going on here. What's the DOJ's argument? What are their reasons? And we're going to be relying on a couple of sources here. First of all, we have the actual motion that the DOJ filed. So we're going to be pulling some quotes from that. We also have a couple of reports from Politico and Law and Crime.
Yeah, those are both really good sources. Very detailed reporting there.
So this is an interesting case because it really touches on kind of the interplay between politics and the judicial system.
Yeah.
And these challenges to executive power, which have become, I don't know, kind of more common, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've seen a few of these cases pop up in recent years. It's definitely something that people who follow this stuff are keeping a close eye on.
Okay, so let's kind of set the stage here. What's the background of this case? Like, what's the actual lawsuit about?
So the lawsuit was brought by Perkins Coie, and they are challenging an executive order that was issued by President Trump on March 6th. And essentially, the order suspends security clearances and access to government buildings for Perkins Coie employees.
And Perkins Coie, like you said, they represented Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016.
Exactly. And, this is not the first time we've seen this sort of executive order. There was a similar order against Covington and Burling. President Trump has, in the past kind of linked that firm to Jack Smith.
The special counsel.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And it seems like, this wasn't a one-off thing. Like, they've tried to do this with other firms. I know there was that one with Paul Weiss that got withdrawn.
Right. That one didn't end up going through. But
Huh.
yeah, this is definitely a pattern that's emerging.
Okay. So that kind of gives us the context. And before we jump into the motion to disqualify Judge Howell, is there anything else we should know about her involvement in the case at this point?
Yeah, so actually, Judge Howell had issued a temporary block on the executive order against Perkins Coie.
Okay. So that's already kind of significant. I mean, the DOJ isn't happy about that, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely suggests that she's not just going to rubber stamp anything the administration does.
Okay. So now let's get into the heart of it.
Mm.
The DOJ wants her off this case. What's their main argument? Why do they want her removed?
Well, they're pretty straightforward about it, actually. In their motion, they say that Judge Howell has repeatedly demonstrated partiality against and animus towards the president.
Wow. Animus towards the president. It's
Yeah.
pretty strong language, right? It's not subtle. And they make it clear they're not just talking about some sort of personal dislike. They say that reasonable observers may well view this court as insufficiently impartial to adjudicate the meritless challenges to President Trump's efforts to implement the agenda that the American people elected him to carry out.
So they're really focusing on the appearance of bias here. Not just whether there's actual bias, but whether it looks bad.
Right. Like, even if she doesn't actually have it out for the president, it might seem that way to someone watching this whole thing unfold.
Okay. Now, I know they cite some specific legal grounds for this motion. What exactly are those?
So they're leaning on a couple of sections of the U.S. Code. One is 28 U.S.C. Section 455A. Basically, that one says a judge has to step aside if there's a reasonable question about their impartiality. And then there's Section 45B1, which is more about personal bias or prejudice against a party in the case.
Okay, so that gives them the legal framework.
Yeah.
And in their motion, do they say anything more specific about how those laws should be applied? Like, what's the standard for recusal?
Yeah, they do actually. They get into some legal precedent here. They argue that the question is whether a reasonable and informed observer would question the judge's impartiality.
So not just any observer, but someone who knows what's going on.
Right. And they go even further. They quote another case saying that any doubts must be resolved in favor of recusal.
Wow. So basically, if there's even a hint of bias, she should step aside.
That's how they're interpreting the law, yeah.
Okay. So we get their legal reasoning. And what exactly are they asking for? What's the outcome they want?
Well, they want Judge Howell to recuse herself from the case. They're asking for it to be transferred to a different judge, someone who they say is free from any appearance of hostility toward this administration and who is otherwise unconnected with any matter related to the Mueller report or Durham investigation.
So someone who's basically never even heard of those things.
It seems like that's what they're going for.
Okay, so that's the big picture. Now let's dive into the specifics. What are the actual examples of bias that the DOJ is pointing to? Like, what did Judge Howell do or say that they found so problematic?
So they start with a speech that Judge Howell gave back in November 2023. She was speaking at an event for the Women's White Collar Defense Association.
Okay. And what was so controversial about that speech?
Well, according to the DOJ, she implied that a Trump presidency would lead to authoritarianism.
Oh, wow. Authoritarianism. That's a loaded term.
Yeah, and it's something that President Trump and his supporters obviously pushed back on pretty hard.
So they're saying that just by saying that, she revealed some kind of preconceived notion about the president and his administration.
Yeah, and Politico actually reported on this speech at the time. They said it led to a judicial misconduct complaint.
So this wasn't just something that the DOJ noticed. Other people were concerned about it too.
Right.
Okay. What else did they cite?
They bring up Judge Howell's response to a statement that President Trump made about potential pardons and commutations for those involved in the January 6th events.
Okay, so this is getting into some pretty sensitive territory.
Yeah, for sure. So President Trump had called the prosecutions related to January 6th a grave national injustice.
Yeah, what did Judge Howell say about that?
Well, in a case called United States v. Jovanovich, she basically rejected that view.
So she disagreed with the president. But how did the DOJ take issue with that? I mean, judges disagree with presidents all the time, right?
True, but they really hone in on the specific language she used. The motion quotes her comments, describing them as wholly inappropriate name-calling.
Oh, name-calling. A judge called someone names.
Well, that's how they're framing it. They say she repeatedly called Trump supporters sore losers, and that she said the president's statement was a revisionist myth.
So they're arguing that it wasn't just a legal disagreement, but that she was actually trying to, delegitimize the president's perspective.
Yeah, I think that's the gist of their argument.
Okay, so that's two examples. What else do they have?
Well, they also bring up a finding that Judge Howell made during Jack Smith's investigation. Remember, he was the special counsel looking into the handling of classified documents.
Yeah, the court.
So at one point, Judge Howell said there was reason to believe that the former president would flee from prosecution.
Oh, wow. So, he might try to run away.
Yeah, that's what she was suggesting.
And the DOJ is using this as another example of bias.
Right. They point out that even the government later admitted that this statement was wrong.
So she made a pretty serious accusation that turned out to be unfounded.
Exactly. And that's feeding into their broader argument that she's too quick to assume the worst about the president.
Okay. Is there anything else?
Yeah, they also highlight a ruling that Judge Howell made regarding attorney-client privilege. This had to do with the grand jury investigating the documents case in Florida.
Okay. Remind me what attorney-client privilege is exactly.
Basically, it means that conversations between a lawyer and their client are confidential. They can't be forced to reveal what they talked about.
Right. So what did Judge Howell do that the DOJ didn't like?
Well, she invoked something called the crime fraud exception. It's basically a way to get around attorney-client privilege if there's evidence that the communication was part of a crime.
Okay, I see. So she said that in this case, the privilege didn't apply. And that's what the DOJ is objecting to.
Yeah, they think she was wrong to do that. And they also raise a concern about the fact that this ruling was made in D.C. while the underlying issue was in Florida.
So they're saying that maybe she shouldn't have been the one making that decision in the first place.
Yeah, they're questioning her jurisdiction there.
Okay. Is there anything else? I feel like we've covered a lot already.
Well, there's one more thing they bring up. Remember that whole thing with Elon Musk and Twitter?
Oh, yeah, when he took over and there was all that chaos with the subpoenas and stuff.
Right. So at one point, Judge Howell held Twitter in contempt for not complying with a subpoena for President Trump's direct messages.
Oh, so she basically said they were disobeying a court order.
Yeah. And in their motion, the DOJ quotes some remarks she allegedly made during that hearing.
Oh, like what kind of remarks?
Well, they say she asked if Musk wants to cozy up with the former president.
So implying that he might be trying to help Trump out.
Right. And they also quote her as asking whether Twitter's actions were to make Donald Trump feel like he is a particularly welcome renewed user of Twitter.
So again, suggesting some kind of favoritism towards Trump.
That's the implication they're drawing, yeah.
Okay. And then finally, there's her comments in the Perkins-Coie case itself, right?
Yes, exactly. Specifically, what she said about President Trump's focus on the Fusion GPS report. You'll recall that Fusion GPS was the firm behind the Steele dossier.
Yeah, which is a big part of the whole Russia investigation thing.
Right. So the DOJ quotes Judge Howell as saying, I know the president has just, based on reading these papers, he was upset about that in 2016. He was so upset about this. Still, He filed a lawsuit against Perkins Coie and others in the Southern District of Florida that was dismissed in rapid order.
Yeah.
He keeps bringing it up. It's like he doesn't want any of us to forget Fusion GPS. He doesn't want any of us to forget that any of this. He really has a bee in his bonnet about it.
Oh, wow. A bee in his bonnet. That's pretty informal language for a judge to use, right?
Yeah, it's definitely not the kind of dry legal language you'd typically expect. And the DOJ seizes on this. In that motion, they say that this comment shows a concerning and dismissive approach to the entire Durham investigation.
Right, because Durham was appointed to look into the origins of the Russia investigation.
Exactly. And they argue that because Perkins Coie was involved in the whole Fusion GPS thing, Judge Howell's comment suggests she's already made up her mind about it.
So they're saying she can't be impartial in this case because she's already decided that Trump is wrong to be concerned about the Fusion GPS report.
Yeah, that's basically their argument.
Okay, so we've gone through a lot here. Let's try to sum this all up. Basically, the DOJ is saying that Judge Howell has a pattern of bias against President Trump and anyone associated with him. They point to her comments and speeches and court hearings, her rulings in other cases, and even her choice of words to argue that she can't be fair in this particular case.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate summary.
And this whole thing is pretty unusual, right? Like, it's not every day that the DOJ tries to get a judge removed.
No, it's definitely a rare move. Both Politico and Law and Crime have said that it's highly unusual for the Justice Department to do this.
So what does that tell us about this situation? Like, why would they go to such lengths?
Well, it suggests they're really concerned about Judge Howell's impartiality. They clearly feel that she poses a serious threat to their case.
And as we've seen, this isn't the first time that President Trump has faced legal challenges. He's had a lot of cases against him over the years.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he's tried to get judges removed before, hasn't he?
He has, but as Law and Crime has reported, those attempts have generally been unsuccessful. He tried it in the Washington election interference case, the Manhattan hush money case, and the Manhattan civil fraud case. All of those were denied.
So it seems like he's had a tough time convincing courts that judges are biased against him.
Yeah. And in this case, it's even more complicated because it's Judge Howell herself who gets to decide whether to recuse herself.
Which seems pretty unlikely, right?
Yeah, Politico has pointed out that it would be very unusual for a judge to agree to step down in a situation like this.
So we'll have to wait and see what she decides. But regardless of what happens, this whole situation raises some pretty big questions about how the judicial system works, especially when it comes to cases with such strong political implications.
Yeah, I think that's right. It really makes you think about what impartiality means and how we ensure that judges are able to make decisions fairly, even in the most contentious cases.
So to our listeners out there who are following this case, we want to hear from you. What do you think about the DOJ's arguments? Do you think Judge Howell should step aside? Or do you think she should stay on the case? Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts.